Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning? Welcome to a new and very important episode of our student-led Israel-Palestine podcast. I'm Yusuf. We are recording this conversation on August 28th, 2025, exactly 62 years after Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the Lincoln Memorial and delivered his I Have a Dream speech. It was a turning point in American history, a vision of justice and equality that inspired the world. But today, that dream feels under threat. Rising antisemitism, racism, and political extremism challenge the very ideals Dr. King gave voice to. That makes today's guest especially timely. We have the great honor of being joined by Professor Kenneth Stern, Director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, which also actively supports the Bard College campus here in Berlin. A very warm welcome, Professor Stern. A privilege to have you.
And it's my honor to be with you. Thank you.
Professor Stern is an award-winning author and attorney, widely recognized as a leading expert on combating anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. For 25 years, he was the director of the Division on Anti-Semitism and Extremism at the American Jewish Committee, and most recently served as the executive director of the Justus Karin Rosenberg Foundation. His books include A Force Upon the Plain, The American Militia Movement and the Politics of Hate, which predicted the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 and was nominated for the National Book Award. His latest book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate, has been widely praised as a thoughtful must-read guide for navigating today's campus controversies. Professor Stern has testified before the U.S. Senate committees in 2024 and 2025 on the current rise of anti-Semitism, particularly on campuses, and has been an invited presenter at the White House Conference on Hate Crimes. He was the lead drafter of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. He also served on the defense team in the landmark London Holocaust denial case David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt, and has argued before the United States Supreme Court. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and The Guardian, and he has been featured on major television and radio outlets worldwide. Professor Stern, again, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. I look forward to having a good conversation with you.
We'll get right into the first question. Professor Stern, since October 7th, we have seen a significant rise in anti-Semitism worldwide. For our listeners, could you start by explaining how you understand anti-Semitism conceptually and how we should think about it in its many forms today?
Sure. I mean, anti-Semitism at heart, I always think of it as a subset of the human capacity to hate. We have, as human beings, we're sort of wired to see who's us and who's them throughout history, regardless of when, regardless of where. Our brains were sort of wired that way because we know, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, who that group over the hill might be and whether they might be a danger to us. So we're sort of poised to make those quick reflexes. And anti-Semitism is a subset of that. Jews were, especially if even though anti-Semitism predated Christianity, if you look back to the time of the beginning of the sort of Christian European world, Jews were these people that refused to go along with the accepted truth that Jesus was God. And what do you do with people who have that type of view that don't go along with the mass of society? Well, you set an example about them. You ostracize them. You ghettoize them. You stigmatize them. And so the beginnings of anti-Semitism happened when, it was a religious-based thing that Jews were seen as somehow other. Move forward in history, and Jews were seen as, when the questions of race came along, we're seen just as a religion, just as a race of people, which Jews are not. Jews are many races, but with the rise of Darwin and so forth, there was an idea that Jews somehow couldn't, change. That's what Nazism, the idea of you had one Jewish grandparent. And in contemporary times, you also have some questions that are much more complicated about Jews and Israel, the connection with that, and whether criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic or not. And, but we can get into that more. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, but it does sometimes play out that way. And historically, anti-Semitism at its worst was always, two things. A conspiracy theory that Jews conspire to harm humanity. So, Jews killing God, Jews poisoning whales, Jews stealing Christian children to bake, matzah out of their blood, Jews, running capitalism, Jews running communism, Jews running the media. All these things about Jewish conspiracy to harm humanity or whichever period, those are the anti-Semitism, at its worst. And we've also found, and what we've seen since October 7th, that every time that Israel, which is identified by many, of course, with Jews inside and outside the Jewish community, every time Israel has been in a shooting war, whether it was in Lebanon or Gaza before or whatever, there's always been an uptick in attacks on Jews. And that's not unique to Jews. I mean, the United States, we saw during the COVID era, when President Trump in his first term was vilifying China and all that, we saw an uptick in attacks on Asians. Their scapegoating is not unusual, and it doesn't only happen to Jews. But we've seen an uptick every time there's been a war. And what's different this time is that the war hasn't stopped. That the trauma and the tragedy of what happened on October 7th is seared into the psyche of Jews and Israelis. And of course, what's been happening since October 7th to Palestinians is seared into people's minds as well. So what you have is the tendency that we had before October 7th, but it's now true on steroids.
You have described anti-Semitism as a canary in the mine, an early warning system for democracies. How does anti-Semitism impact not only Jewish communities, but democracy as such?
Well, it's actually two things. I mean, and I didn't come up with the canary in the coal mine. Somebody else did a long time ago. But if you look at history, I mean, certainly look at history, in Germany, the organizing of the Nazi Party around principles in many ways of anti-Semitism, led to disastrous results for all of Germany. And you look at other, histories around the world, anti-Semitism, has been, it's not just a religious prejudice. It's a ideology. It's an explanation for what goes wrong in the world, as I said. And so it also serves as a sort of fuel for attacks, authoritarian attacks, anti-democratic attacks. And, that's been a challenge. But to me, the thing that gets ignored, which is the flip side of the canary in the coal mine, chestnut, is that anti-Semitism itself actually can rise and does when anybody among a group in society is vilified. And when I speak to Jewish audiences in the United States and they ask me what I worry about most about anti-Semitism today, I'm worrying less about what an 18-year-old college student may be saying, although some people might find what they say disturbing, and there have been some instances that are disturbing. But I'm worrying more about two things. One is the attacks in the United States, transgender folks, immigrants, Muslims, and others, because that's a conveyor belt to anti-Semitism. I mean, if you think back to the Charlottesville rally in 2017 in the United States, when you had white supremacists saying Jews will not replace us at a protest over the removal of a Confederate general's statue, how did Jews get into the mix? Well, because if you're a white supremacist and you think that somehow you're losing a battle to people that are inferior to you. How do you understand that? Somebody must be putting their fingers on the scale. And that's the Jews. So the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, where the background noise to that was panic over, quote, invaders over the southern border. And the synagogue had a program for immigrants about immigration and was a target. So, that's one thing. I say if you don't just focus on the, other things that are happening in society, the promotion of white supremacy and the vilification of anybody else sends people on a conveyor belt to anti-Semitic thinking. The other thing that I've been saying to synagogues on this point is that, to me, the capacity to fight hatred, the capacity to fight anti-Semitism requires strong democratic principles. If you don't have freedom of speech, if you don't have freedom of the press, if you don't have free judiciary to make decisions in independent rule of law, it's more likely that you will see authoritarian pushes, the things that will promote anti-Semitism. And what's troubling in the United States today is that in the guise of combating anti-Semitism, particularly allegedly on the campus, we're seeing the breakdown of due process. We're seeing people deported. We're seeing, clawbacks of money from universities without any going through the really outlined procedures that are administrative law. So we're seeing anti-Semitism, at least the first time I've seen it in this way in my lifetime, being used as an excuse to try to, attack democratic institutions and try to attack higher education. And I worry about that. And even though that some people in the Jewish community might be saying, yeah, it's a good thing, they're saying something about anti-Semitism. In the long run, I think it actually promotes anti-Semitism and is not good for Jews. It makes Jews less safe.
Turning to the situation on the ground, could you give us a situational report? How has anti-Semitism increased since October 7, 2023 in the US and Europe, and what does the evidence show?
Well, as I said before, we've always seen an uptick in hate crimes when Israel is involved in a shooting war, and that's what we've seen here. We've seen an increase in attacks. We've seen an increase in incidents, and the question is really whatever this period is that we're still in the middle of 2 years plus. Or almost when it ends, what is that going to be? Is that going to be back to the pre-October 7th level of anti-Semitism? You always have anti-Semitism, you always have racism, you always have bigotry of different types. But is it still going to be at the level where Jews are worried about in Europe sometimes? Physically being attacked because they're seen as Jewish or known to be Israelis. I mean, when people get into these heightened us versus them buckets and get into this idea that, somebody representing somebody else is evil, that increases the probability they're going to be attacked, and it certainly got heightened. The Israel-Palestine debate, and mentioned in the introduction about my book, I wrote about it in 2020 because I saw that this was such a divisive issue that people were getting into their own sort of self-fulfilling buckets of vilifying the other side. And the way it was playing out on campus was that each side was trying to stop the other from speaking because they found the speech that they were giving was one that they found deeply disturbing and wanted to suppress it. The first chapter in the book goes from why is this so contentious? And it pulls from hate studies, again, from brain science and social psychology and other fields, to recognize that when our identity gets tethered to an issue of social justice or injustice, certain things start to happen because of the way our brains work, because of the way our cultures work. We crave simplicity, we crave certainty, we crave symbols, and we crave, sort of binary thinking. We crave to be in our tribe, so to speak, and to vilify the other side. And I see those things as getting more fuel because of what happened and October 7th and its aftermath, to each side sort of seeing the other as problematic. I mean, you started quoting about Martin Luther King, and I'm old enough to remember as a kid, watching that speech and reading a lot of King in high school. And the thing that was really remarkable to me about Martin Luther King was Jim Crow's America should be. He was speaking to people that weren't, African American, but he was speaking to everybody. He was talking about what a society should be. He was underscoring the idea that we're all human beings first. And that's part of the problem and challenge at the moment is that I've seen too many instances where people exhibit empathy for just one side, empathy for the Israelis who were attacked, for the hostages that are still being held, or empathy for the Palestinians who are just, in Gaza, who are living under deplorable conditions, bombing, orphans, unfathomable. And people have a hard time keeping empathy for both in their hearts and in their minds. And I think that's one of our jobs is to try to encourage that, to make people think that what would I feel like if I were in somebody else's shoes? And that's what Martin Luther King was so good at being able to do.
How exactly is anti-Semitism measured? Are the same methods used in the US, Germany, and globally?
It's a great question. And, I don't think we measure it as well. There's not one sort of common metric, but I look at it as a bunch of different things, right? Anti-Semitism is certainly behavior. We can look at hate crimes and the number of hate crimes. We could look at attitudes, what people think about Jews. And there is survey data that changes some over the time, but there's some historic questions about anti-Semitic, tropes. Jews try to control the media, Jews control the weather, Jews, those types of conspiratorial things. And some of them are applied sometimes to Israel. You just cut and paste Jews in Israel, and you see those things too. So those are things that people look at. It seems to me that there are other considerations as well in the mix. The amount of discrimination in everyday life. In American society, when 100 years ago, there were quotas keeping Jews out of colleges. There were glass ceilings in businesses. That's not the case anymore. So that's something to put in the mix too. Compared to other groups as well, there's a level of relative, question of how much bigotry is there. It's more bigotry towards Jews than somebody else, transgender folks or whatever. Not to say that, you diminish. I'm just saying that you have to put it in a relative scale to know where a society is. Another thing is that if you look back 25 years ago, I remember the debate in the Jewish community when Al Gore was running for president in the year 2000. And Lieberman, who's Jewish, an Orthodox Jew, was the Democratic vice presidential candidate. And there was very little pushback except for the people that put out on the fringe anti-Semitic stuff. And of course, they were going to do that, but there's very little pushback on the fact that he was Jewish. And the people started saying, well, anti-Semitism has disappeared. And what was the major concern of the Jewish community at the time? It was intermarriage. The Jews are being loved to death. So all those factors are ones that you should look at to consider the level of anti-Semitism. And I don't think we tend to default to one statistic, the number of hate crimes or attitudinal things, without putting them in larger context.
What types of incidents are most common today? Threats, physical attacks, or online harassment?
Well, I think there's a lot of online problems. It's not only anti-Semitism. There are lots of hateful things that happen online. There certainly has been an uptick on incidents, and there have been, at least in the United States, some pretty horrible attacks. There was in Colorado, there were some people that were holding a vigil for the hostages, and somebody poured gasoline on them. There an incident at an embassy or embassy officials of Israel that were attending an American Jewish Committee event who were killed. So there have been, incidents like that get people's attention. And there have been some incidents where businesses that are associated with Jews have been, either boycotted or protested, and we've seen an increase of things like that. And those things are troubling. Sometimes it's hard to disentangle whether this is because it's Jewish or because the group there may have done something that supported Israel, and anti-Israel folks are organizing. But we've seen some, increase in that both here and in Europe over the last 2 years almost.
Speaking of the digital world, on platforms like TikTok, we're seeing a troubling surge in extreme forms of anti-Semitism, including Holocaust denial. Are there reliable studies analyzing this phenomenon? Where does it come from, and what are broader implications?
Well, there are some groups, ISD and some others that do analysis of what's happening online. Two things. I mean, I was writing like 20 some odd years ago when the internet was new, and people were freaking out about all the hate stuff on the internet. That it's a new medium, and it provides an opportunity for people to say and do things. And there's a flip side to it too. I mean, you mentioned in the introduction the book I wrote, Force Upon the Plain. Well, it didn't, it came out after the Oklahoma City bombing, but it was the research on it led me to put out a report 9 or 10 days before the bombing, talking about that date, April 19th, having significant to the militia folks, and somebody was going to do something because we were watching online to see, the early bulletin boards, to seeing what they were saying and what they were planning, and trying to raise alarm bells on that. So there's, it's a double-edged sword. Yeah, there's stuff there that people are putting on there that are pretty awful. But it also allows the rest of us to get a sense of what people in extremist groups are organizing for. There's a big debate here and in Europe, which doesn't have the First Amendment protections, about how to regulate speech. Back at the time where the internet was new, I think some of the consensus between the Europeans and the Americans at conferences I went to was, we're not going to repeal the First Amendment. There's certain speech that obviously would be illegal under any context, direct, true threats and so forth. But that, we encouraged the internet companies at the time to sort of divide the world into those who allowed, anything there, and those that had standards, because they were private companies, to say this is what we're want on a platform. If you can't live with these standards, you go to someplace else. And I think those principles still pretty much apply. I mean, what interests me more than how you should regulate TikTok or any other platforms is, are we not, how do we use this new tool more effectively to help in the fight against hate? And I'll give you an example. Working with some folks, so we'll see if we can pull this off. But it was premised on a couple of instances where social media really did have an impact, and I'll tell you very briefly two of them. One of them was there was a neo-Nazi group or a leader that was going to hold a march actually on Martin Luther King Day in western Montana to threaten the human rights groups there and the Jewish community. And it was going to bring up a bunch of armed skinheads from Oakland. And what we did is we used social media, because you can protest in Montana and you can do it armed because it's an open carry state. We got people from around the world to say, well, if you do this march, we're going to give money to things you detest based on how you march. So it gave them a disincentive. The money would have gone to anti-bias education and police training and so forth. So they would have been effectively fundraising. They ended up not coming. It gave people something more powerful to do than just put a like on Facebook. An example, in 2020, I had a friend in Eastern Washington who connected me with a friend in Northern Idaho, which has had a white supremacist problem for a while. And there was a woman that had a Biden for President lawn sign on her lawn, and it got picked up and replaced with the Confederate flag. And this happened 6 times, I believe, and the police didn't come until the 6th time. Her house also got splattered with paint. Police finally showed up. And he connected me with her, and I'm talking with her, and I happen to know what do you do when the local police aren't responding well. Who do you call? Who's the human rights groups in the community there? Where's the support she can get? And so I think, why does she need to talk to me? Isn't there a way to use AI so that people that are victims of hate crimes could know the resources, be connected to groups that could help them and so forth? So, those are the types of things we're looking at, as opposed to just bemoaning the stuff that goes on there. How can we use this to more effectively? And I think the more that we do that, the better off we'll be fighting hate.
Given this global surge, universities have become central battlegrounds in both the US and Germany, raising complex questions about balancing student safety and freedom of speech. How do these broader trends manifest on campuses? How would you describe the current situation on US and German campuses?
Yeah, it's a great question. And then what I see deeply troubles me, and that's why I wrote that book, in 2020. As I said, each side was trying to shut down the other. And what's being lost here are a number of things. First, no student should actually be harassed or threatened, let alone assaulted or bullied. Discrimination that violates the law. Those things should not happen, period. Students should hear, especially on the college level, but I think also, the high school students are old enough for this too, to hear different points of view and to be protected from the idea that you're going to hear something that disturbs you is, to me, the antithesis of what an education should be. The idea, especially in a college, is you should be disturbed by ideas. Why else are you spending the time there? Why else are parents investing money? You're 18 to 22 on a college campus. Chances are you're not going to solve Israel-Palestine, but you are going to develop in that environment an ability to develop your own thinking and not to go along with groupthink. And if things disturb you, the university has a responsibility to help educate you about it and to give you resources and so forth, but not to protect you from hearing, oh, this thing might disturb you. I had a colleague at Bard when was hearing people, Bard and elsewhere, using terms like genocide, settler colonialism, racism, anti-Semitism, Zionism, anti-Zionism. And a lot of places around the country were talking about, we're going to, focus on trying to stop some of that speech. She said, no. We're college. Why don't we have a class? What do these words mean? Why do people hear them differently? How do they hear them differently? So those are the things that I think, should happen. But what I'm seeing more is a tendency to try to, and this, predates the Trump administration in the United States. It's happening in Florida and elsewhere, trying to stop some speech. And it's not just about Israel-Palestine. I mean, there are attempts in the United States to stop teaching about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm not a fan of everything that comes under that. I think a lot of that is very binary and, power, privilege, race, and putting that as a template to ignore all the other complexities of life. And that's wrong. But I don't want the government saying, can't teach about these things, about racism, about transgender things. That is problematic. Again, you have a word search in Florida using the IHRA definition for classes. That's chilling of what a professor can teach. You had, in the UK, and this again predates this while ago, I think it was 2015, 16, 17, something like that. The idea that you use the definition to apply to universities, and they stopped an Israel Apartheid Week event. You had a situation in Germany where the definition was used to target Jews who were protesting the Gaza war and labeling anti-Semites, which was awful because it's an internal Jewish debate about Israel that shouldn't be decided by states and so forth. And even in the United States, you're seeing some legislation that I think is terribly awful. There was one, thank God, it was vetoed by a Democratic governor in Arizona. The legislation would have taken, the definition, required it as a template in schools, and given parents an individual right to sue teachers if something happened in their classroom. that violated a definition. As I said at the beginning, democracy and free speech are important preconditions to being able to fight any type of hatred and to use the concerns about anti-Semitism to corrupt democracy. It's actually the last thing you want to do, and I'm seeing some of those pushes here and abroad.
Speaking of which, how should universities distinguish between legitimate political speech and actionable conduct, such as threats, harassment, or intimidation? For example, in Germany, we have seen the grave physical assault against the Jewish student Lahav Shapira. How should institutions effectively prevent such cases from happening?
Well, I think universities do have, tools to deal with actual harassment, assault. Somebody puts graffiti, doesn't matter what the content is. You can't put graffiti. Those are the things. What I'm concerned about in the United States, and I suspect in Germany too, is you have people trying to say, well, somebody says from the river to the sea, and that should be against the disciplinary code. I mean, that was a famous December 5th hearing in the House where Representative Stefanik grilled 3 college presidents and said, doesn't it? Well, she did a bait and switch. She said, river to the sea is a call for genocide against Jews. And isn't that against your disciplinary policy? And when they said it depended on the context, which is actually the correct answer, but it was sort of tone deaf in the viral moment, they got into a lot of trouble. But let's break that down a little bit, okay? First of all, from the river to the sea, I find, disturbing because I know how Hamas means it. But not every 18-year-old is going to mean it that way. And there was a survey that said 66% of Jewish students felt that it was eliminationist to get rid of Jews. 14% of Muslim students meant it that way. They meant it freedom for Palestinians, freedom from the river to the sea. Look at it more, complexly, right? Historically, the Likud party platform talked about Jewish sovereignty from the river to the sea. And as I will tell Jewish audiences, and they don't sometimes like me to hear me say it, I said, if you ask a Palestinian, why are you talking about a chant? The Israelis have control from the river to the sea. Step back even further. As I testified in front of Congress, I said, look, I was at the American Jewish Committee working on anti-Semitism in the 90s when David Duke, an unreconstructed neo-Nazi, former Klan leader, who had been an elected representative in Louisiana, was running for statewide office. And I did a background report on Duke and went back to including his college days. And what happened to him in college? He went on a radio program and said all blacks should be sent back to Africa, all Jews should be exterminated. And then the following year, he paraded around with an actual Nazi uniform. He wasn't, as far as we know, he wasn't disciplined. He would have loved to have been disciplined for it. He was vilified for it, correctly so. I'm not saying ignore that type of speech. There should be strong counter speech when somebody says something that's hateful, and a college should give the environment for discussing why people have these different points of views. But when you start defining certain speech as problematic, that is the wrong way to go on a college. And what you lose in that is you lose the ability to see exactly what you were talking about. What the problem is when somebody gets spit upon, when somebody gets shoved, when somebody gets threatened in a real way. And that's the distinction, not to talk about, disciplining people for what they say. I'm again not saying ignore it. I'm saying there are opportunities to counter speak. But that's the divide that's being lost, I think, in many places, including the United States, about what's really should be actionable and what speech that we should speak out against.
Could you give examples of how to differentiate legitimate criticism of the Israeli government from anti-Semitism that may disguise itself as a political critique on campuses?
Well, what we're really talking about in many ways is anti-Zionism. So there's some anti-Zionism against, the idea of a Jewish state expressed itself using the historic tropes of conspiratorial thinking, just cutting and pasting Jews into that picture. Hamas does that, others do that, and that's clearly the case. It does happen. Look at the other side of that line. You have Palestinians for whom the objection to Israel's existence isn't because it's Jewish. It's because of what happened to them. It would have been the same if it was somebody else. There's a Derek Penzler, who's a historian at Harvard, wrote a "What If" piece about, well, what would have happened if the Templars, which is a Christian group that had some historic presence in the land of now Israel, had come back and reconstituted themselves? Would the reaction be the same as towards the Jewish state, or different? Would it have been more like Rhodesia? I mean, those are reasonable questions. And the Palestinians that will talk to me, I'm a Zionist, and a lot of people won't, but the people that do, their objection is precisely because the reconstituting of Israel had a terrible effect on Palestinians being able to control their lives. I don't find that as anti-Semitic. It isn't because it's Jews, it's because of what happened to them. Then, to add to the complexity, and this relates to what I was talking about before about the use of the IHRA definition in Germany about Jews who were protesting the war in Gaza, is you have a deep internal debate about Zionism and Israel, and Judaism. I mean, Jews have had an historical, connection with the land of Israel. Just read the Bible and you see that, right? And Jews have always been there. Synagogues face towards Israel. It's part of, the Jewish tradition. Yet, Zionism is a more modern idea coming from the 1880s and, post-Holocaust, the Jewish influx, especially into the land of Israel, and you have Jews for whom Zionism is a core part of their Judaism. And I think even probably I wrote in my book that people different levels of or different affiliations to Judaism, that Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, get together for a meal. They have a difference of opinion about Israel. That's more of a divide, and they can't sit together. It's more of a third rail issue. But you have Jews who, it's a minority, but a lot of younger Jews in colleges, anecdotally, many of them are the grandchildren of the children of people that were very involved in Jewish communal life, who went to Jewish day school, perhaps, and their Judaism leads them to think about, how do I repair the world, which is a Jewish concept? How do I treat the stranger, which is a Jewish concept? And that leads them to a place where they say, well, I can't justify a Jewish state with these Jewish principles. Now, I may disagree with them politically, and otherwise I think you need a two-state solution. Otherwise, I think both people need to be able to express their self-determination. And even before October 7th, Jews were not going to trust their security to somebody else. But I'm not going to call them anti-Semites. And there's so those are the two sort of extremes: clearly anti-Semitic, not anti-Semitic at all. Then you have a bunch of stuff in the middle, which is, are you looking at this, how people hear it? Are you looking at what people intend? It's okay. Many things in life, you don't have bright lines, and it's okay to live it sort of in the middle of it. So, what I've seen in this debate is that people are trying to say, as Jared Kushner said when Trump signed an executive order using IHRA, all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Some people saying no, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And we have to, engage those complexities as opposed to being seduced by these, binaries of yes, it is, no, it isn't.
How do you evaluate recent government responses in the US and Germany to the rise of antisemitism?
Well, I see it in a couple of ways. One, you asked me before, how do we measure anti-Semitism? One of the things that I think is important is, does government care about it, right? And in the Biden administration, when there were some attacks, there were meetings at the White House, there was attention thrown on it, which is what you want to see. I mean, if you're a community that's under assault, and the government, doesn't say anything or do anything about it, that's deeply problematic. So I think that's a good sign that there's been attention to it, and the government under the Biden administration actually put out a very comprehensive national strategy that you try to use all aspects of society to identify and combat anti-Semitism. I'm using programs like AmeriCorps that brings people to do service, other things to do. So I thought that was a really good thing. Under the Trump administration, I see something different. And I think that there are some people that say, oh, he's trying to, stop some of the things that we don't like hearing on the campus. That's a good thing. I don't believe that I think they see anti-Semitism as a political tool that they can use for a larger purpose. And if you look back at some of the speeches, for example, about Vice President J.D. Vance when he was a senator, he was talking about attacking education in a way very much like Viktor Orban did in Hungary. And Bard has a school called Central European University that used to be in Budapest, liberal arts, just like the one in Berlin, although I think it had master's programs too. And he booted it out. It's now reconstituted in Vienna. And so it's part of the assault on the idea of education. And what troubled me, going back to that question about, Elise Stefanik, who was grilling those presidents about River to the Sea, she was incapable, as far as I know, of condemning, Trump when he talked about immigrants poisoning the blood of America, which is Hitler's speech, when he wined and dined a Holocaust denier at Mar-a-Lago. She couldn't be moved to say anything, but now she becomes a champion on anti-Semitism. So I think a lot of it, what we see in the contemporary view, is using anti-Semitism as a political tool. And that's not to say that there isn't anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism shouldn't be combated, but I see people using it, for other political goals, and that deeply troubles me.
What are the most effective practical steps that universities, communities, or governments can take to protect Jewish students while still respecting free speech?
Well, I think, again, you want to protect students from being harassed, intimidated, bullied, and no tolerance, for that. But, I think the way to engage these issues when they come on a campus is to find ways to get students to creatively discuss them. One of the things that I had in my book, because I wanted to end it after describing what the problem was with some practical solutions, is I gave an example of a course that I found that some professor had put together that was based on the Peel Commission, which was when the Brits had the mandate for Palestine in the 30s and sent Lord Peel to go and talk to the Jews and the Arabs and come up with some recommendations of what to do. And the class was based on the Peel Commission. Students had to spend about half the class researching, then half the class reenacting what the Peel Commission did, faithfully representing a Jew, an Arab, or a Brit. And I found out about this because there was an odd fact that it was a Pakistani Muslim woman who had to be 6 or 8 weeks or whatever it was in the shoes of David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli first prime minister. And when I talked to her, she said, you think that was weird? I had an Israeli classmate who had to portray the Mufti of Jerusalem, and as much as a pain in the butt as he was when we were reenacting the commission, the person who is the far-right Jabotinsky figure, Jewish, on her side was more difficult to deal with. So real history, real enacting it. And when I talked to the person who created this course, she said that people used to come in saying, now we'll know how Israel-Palestine should have been solved. And they come out of the class saying, now we know why, 80 some odd years since the Peel Commission, it still hasn't been solved. So real education. I'll give you another example of what I think universities should do to engage these issues. I think they should have a lot more classes on free speech, academic freedom, anti-Semitism, hate, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian animus, protest, all those things, get educated about them. But there's also a really very interesting AI tool that I've been sharing with Bard faculty and others. I came across it last year. There's some faculty members from Carnegie Mellon who are big data guys, but one of them had taught a class on difficult issues. And he put together this thing called SWAY, S-W-A-Y. I have it in my Senate testimony, I think on page 18 with the footnote and the data. But what it does is it gets students on difficult issues, whether Israel, Palestine, abortion, whatever, with diametrically opposed views and pairs them off, and they have a text-driven discussion. So no anger, no eye rolls, but it interrupts when there's an ad hominem attack. Are you stupid? Are you an idiot? And it stops that. It suggests ways of rephrasing things, and the data seems to show that it opens up empathy. It opens up the ability to see that somebody with a different point of view isn't necessarily evil or saying horrible things. And that's what education should be. So I think you need more resources like that to telegraph to students that you're going to hear things that are going to disturb you. That's okay. And we're going to actually build on that to help you become critical thinkers. But we are going to protect you from actually being harassed, intimidated, bullied, threatened, assaulted, and so forth.
You emphasize that all forms of hate must be addressed equally. Why is this not only a matter of fairness, but also critical to effectively combating anti-Semitism?
Well, I think, it's not like a scale of, if there's more of a problem in one place of one type of hate than another, I think that deserves, more attention. I'm not saying that if Black churches are being assaulted and some other group isn't, that not to pay, attention to the Black churches more, because that might be something that's more of immediate concern. But what I mean is that we tend to think of anti-Semitism as sort of unique, and all forms of bigotry have their unique aspects, right? But when you start looking at it as somehow this is just about Jews and what people are saying about Jews, let alone Israel, you're missing so much about how hatred actually works. And you have to understand that that there's a bleeding between different types of hatred. I mentioned Charlottesville before, and I mentioned the anti-immigrant sentiment that led to the background noise for the Tree of Life shooting. So I think to understand how hatred works, you need a wide lens. What are the things that are pulling people into hateful thoughts? What are the things that may be animating them from vilifying somebody else to hating Jews? If your main concern is anti-Semitism, and there's a lot of data and good academic backgrounds on them. I mean, there's a classic book about women in the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, which is racist, anti-Semitic, and so forth. And one of the things that the author Kathleen Bleed discovered was that they came to their anti-Semitism and their racism differently. Their racism, at least they would, who knows if it was true or not, but they would actually be able to point to a story. I was riding on a bus and there was a young Black girl who was playing her music too loud, and that's where I learned I don't like Black people. With Jews and anti-Semitism, it was not that they met a Jew and had a bad experience. It was like an aha moment. Now I know how the world really works. There are these secret folks behind the scenes running things. So when you just look at, and that's part of the problem with the definitional wars about, we want a simple thing. We want to, have a sieve to, is this okay? Is this not okay? We don't look how it all sort of fits together. And that's what I think is important. It's a question of how do you see society? How do you see culture? How do you see the ability to, again, have strong democratic institutions, including the protection for free speech, including speech we don't like, including hateful speech, to allow an environment where we can fight anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, but do it comprehensively and do it smartly. I mean, we have a book coming out from our center published by the University of Toronto called Simply Human, Understanding Hatred and How to Combat It. And one of the chapters is written by a hate study scholar who's a philosopher who raises the question about should there be some equivalent of a Hippocratic oath for those of us who are fighting hate, at least to be able to articulate some principles of we're not going to make it worse because we're responding in anger and protection for our tribe and so forth. And I think those are part of the issues, to look at it in a larger scope and be smarter about how we combat it.
You mentioned the definition of IHRA earlier multiple times. Much of the current controversy revolves around the use and potential misuse, as critics are cautioning, of the so-called IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. You were the lead drafter. Could you explain the context in which this definition was developed?
Sure. Well, I was not involved. IHRA adopted the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016, but they adopted the text for which I was the lead drafter that came out of something called the EUMC, the European Monitoring Center on Xenophobia, Racism, and so forth. And what had happened was that as I mentioned before, when this shooting involving Israel and the peace process is collapsing and the Second Intifada happened, and other things were happening in the early 2000s, there was an increase in attacks on Jews worldwide, but particularly in Europe. And EUMC was tasked with putting out reports, and it put out a report in 2004 that found, the data seemed fairly reliable. The incidents that were happening, the attacks were both from the far right and also some young Arab and Muslim folk in the outskirts of Paris and so forth responsible for some things as well. So the data seemed to be reflective of what we were seeing, but they pointed to a real problem. They said, "What we have?" I forget if it was 40 or 50 countries that were sending them data. They said they don't have the common song sheet. They don't know. They're not looking at the same thing. We need a definition so that these data collectors are basically identifying the same things. With the idea being, we can compare across borders. We can compare across time. We need a standardized way of looking at things. They said they'll have a temporary definition of anti-Semitism, and that was basically a series of stereotypes about Jews, which you can argue whether that makes sense or not. But what they said that caught my eye afterwards is they said, what do we do if a Jew in the streets of a European city is attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli? And they said if the attacker had these stereotypical attitudes about Jews, applied them to Israelis and reapplied them to the poor person that was in front of them, that's anti-Semitism. We should count it. But if they were just upset at Israeli policy and attacked that Jewish person, it's lamentable, but it shouldn't be counted. And I thought, again, that was nuts. As I mentioned, I grew up in the civil rights era. Imagine a black person being assaulted because somebody had these negative stereotypes about black people, but if they were upset at something political, Martin Luther King's speech perhaps, that wouldn't be counted. So I had a colleague at AJC who had put together a panel on anti-Semitism in Europe and invited the head of EUMC to be part of that panel. This is in May of 2004. And about 3 weeks beforehand, there was a firebombing of a Montreal Jewish day school. Nobody was hurt, but it was in reaction to an Israeli assassination of a Hamas leader. So I took the opportunity, even though as a staff person, you're really not supposed to, you're supposed to leave it for the lay people to ask people questions. But I took a risk and went up to a microphone and publicly asked her about that Montreal event and said, you wouldn't count that. That doesn't make sense. So that opened up the opportunity for us to work with EUMC to create a definition. The reason it has examples in it, and that's the heart of the definition, is again primarily to give the data collectors insight into what to include and what to exclude. It also had some really clear language about hate crime. If somebody is selected to be a victim because they're Jewish, it doesn't matter what's in the mind of politics or whatever. There was a case a couple of years later where it illustrated this in France, where a Jew was kidnapped and held for ransom. And people were saying, well, that's a positive stereotype. How could that be anti-Semitism? No. This is based on U.S. law. It doesn't matter what your motive is. If your intent is to select somebody based on who they are. So that was a key point. And we wanted to also use it for some diplomatic purposes when Iran talked about wiping Israel off the map. But, the core of it was to give data collectors, guidance. And what happened was I started seeing around 2010, it came out in January of 2005, we gave them I was the lead drafter. They adopted it with some modifications, some minor ones. But 5 years later, I started seeing how it was being used, not in the way that we intended. It was not generating reports. It was not generating data. It was being used to go after pro-Palestinian speech, and first in the United States. Long story short is that in 2010, the Department of Education in the United States made it clear. They put out a letter saying that Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities were protected under something called the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that protects students from a pervasively, objectively hostile, threatening campus environment. But it didn't cover religion, it covered race and some other categories. They said, no, as ethnicities, Jews, are covered too. I thought, great. I actually brought a case for some Jewish high school students in a place where there was a Kick a Jew Day, and the school district did nothing. And it gave us a good ability to get the Department of Education involved. So far, so good. What happened was that you had some groups on the right of the Jewish pro-Israel community that started saying, we have this handy-dandy definition, so let's start bringing Title VI cases. And then, the Title VI cases, some which had some things like spitting and things that we, talked about before, are not okay. But they started talking about what a professor is teaching, or what texts are being, assigned, what readings are being assigned, what speakers are coming to campus, and saying that these things that in their view, and they stretched the definition in the Israel examples beyond any recognition, they said that those things would serve as a Title VI violation. So that's the trajectory of what it was intended for, why it was put together, and how I started seeing it abused. And then you flip forward to 2016, and then the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance officially adopted the text and has been promoting that, to governments and so forth. And the idea of using it as the European handbook. If you look at the IHRA language on the definition, shows they are proposing it to again control what's being said on a campus, who gets funded, arts, culture, nonprofit status in ways that we never intended. They're using it as a very authoritarian way to say if you say certain things that they believe violate the definition, it has consequences. They're using it as a legal hate speech code or a de facto hate speech code. And to me, that actually harms society, harms the academy, and harms Jews.
Could you elaborate how it should be properly used as a monitoring tool to ensure comparable data collection?
Well, I mean, that, in some ways, I think that ship has sailed. There's some groups that have been using it, ISD, and a few others, which are fine. Yeah, they're looking at things online. And so they're not using it as a wedge to try to censor speech. And so, I was doing an interview the other day, and somebody said, well, would you drafted it differently? And I said, no, at the time that it came out, these European groups needed some guidance. They needed something that wasn't, esoteric. They needed something with, should I include this? Should I not include this? And there was a correlation, as, we talked about before, between, some things that are being said about Israel, especially when Israel is involved in a war, and some attitudes towards Jews. So it was fair to include it. Just like I think if you were able to do a parallel definition of racism in the United States and say, well, if you're objecting to the removal of a Confederate statue, you're objecting to affirmative action, or you're objecting to, Black Lives Matter, that might be a reasonable thing for a data collector to say, well, there's a correlation here maybe between those types of political positions and the level of racism in society. But that doesn't get translated into saying that you have this position on any of these issues and therefore you're a racist. Well, this is how it's being used on, anti-Semitism. So I think it's been poisoned to the, to the effect that it hasn't been used for how it was intended. I wish, especially the language on the, how to think about hate crimes was to me, the most critical part of it. And that hasn't been used as well as I had hoped. So the answer I always say is no. You don't want any definition that's state imposed of a bigotry to define what's being taught, who's getting funded, and all those things. You can have discussions about it. When I teach about it, I use all these different definitions because they're great, ways of talking about how people think about anti-Semitism differently. But as a tool of the state, And in the German situation that I mentioned, and I cited this in my Senate testimony, there was an article that said, "Isn't it ironic that Germany, by adopting the definition and applying it to Jews who were protesting in Gaza, isn't it ironic that Germany is yet again deciding what it means to be Jewish, what's a legitimate Jewish position?" I don't want governments deciding that. Again, I think there's an internal, deep, divisive, internal Jewish debate that I think has to be engaged by the Jewish community of where people are in relation to Zionism in Israel. I don't want the state deciding that. I don't want colleges deciding which side of that they want to come down on either. I think it's inappropriate.
How do you view the current political use of the IHRA definition in the US and Germany, particularly attempts to use it as a legal definition?
Yeah, I think, one of the great ironies is that if you look at the language of IHRA, they say it's non-legally binding. Yet they're all pushing for it to be, adopted in law. And I think it's I've said this before. It's like McCarthyism in the United States. You're young to remember, but there was a time in the 1950s when there was a fear of communism, and I understand why at that time. There certainly was reason to have fears of communism in the United States. But it went to the point where professors were being fired, that there were essentially, loyalty oaths. There's a case I cited in my, I think the testimony last fall before the Judiciary Committee about going after a particular professor for teaching, things that were Marxist. It was very similar to what Florida was doing for its word search on questions about Israel. And the upshot of this is miserable. I mean, just most recently, and I have a piece coming out about this, I think, next week. Columbia University, under pressure from the Trump administration, did a number of things, and the Trump administration clawed back money improperly, did all those things. I mean, threatened the university in a way. I'm happy every day I'm not a university president having to negotiate how to keep our university alive under this type of blunt assault, but adopted the IHRA definition. You had what? You had a Jewish professor of genocide whose family were Holocaust survivors who said, "I may have to quit. I don't know if I can teach Hannah Arendt anymore in this environment because it may be violative of the definition that my school has just adopted." You had Rashid Khalidi. I don't agree with Khalidi about everything, but he's a fine scholar. He's probably the leading Palestinian academic in the United States, if not the world. He had a class with almost 300 people. He said, "I can't teach this under this rubric." That's the impact of it. Students who should be able to engage the world around them and deal with issues like this and investigate them and try on ideas and be wrong and figure out what they think about it are not going to be able to do that when the professors are worried that they're going to be under the gun. People are going to sue them. The government's going to come after them for that. And what about foreign students in the United States? I mean, I've had the pleasure of teaching students who have come from different countries and mentoring some of them. Some of them come because they like the American educational model and the free speech traditions, and some of them come from countries that don't have that, and some talked about going back to their countries and taking the wisdom of having a free speech culture and trying to support that in the countries that they came from. They're not going to be able to say those things anymore. If they come to the country at all and they engage in ideas that the government doesn't like, they may be deported. So, that's how it's being used. I think it's being used as an authoritarian wedge, and that troubles me deeply.
How can we address complex situations on campuses and in public discourse without either under-recognizing or over-labeling anti-Semitism related to Israel and Palestine?
I think, I think I gave you some ideas before.
Yeah.
The sway thing is a great way. I mean, you should you should look that up, because I think even though it's mostly for college, I think it'd be really useful for high school students too. I think engage it with courses, reading a lot of things. The what I wrote my book, I had an interesting conversation with a friend who read it in draft, and I figured it needed a chapter on, okay, what's the sort of 101 about the Jewish Israeli narrative, and what's the sort of, basis of the general Palestinian narrative. And, I put them together and I thought they were fairly fair. And I got a response from her. She said, have you thought about which one you're going to put first? She said, it's really important to think about that. And I had not thought about that. And then I concluded I'm going to put the Jewish one first, probably because I'm more comfortable with it and know it better. But then I have a long footnote at the end of that part of the description, and I said, imagine I recounted that conversation. I said, imagine if you're a Jewish person, Zionist, pro-Israel, and I put the Palestinian narrative first. And Jews came in as secondary characters, basically to thwart your attempt to control your own life. So that's how Palestinians think of the Jewish narrative. And the ability to be able to carry both, to understand both, to have empathy for both, to understand the complexities, engage them, is critically important. I have another sort of couplet in my book that also illustrates this as well. In a prior life, when I was a young trial lawyer, I represented a lot of American Indian activists, including the co-founder of the American Indian Movement. So I knew a lot of Indian folks, and I saw that there was a letter to the Iroquois Confederacy in upstate New York from the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACB. And why were they writing to the Iroquois? Well, the Iroquois claimed that they invented lacrosse. These guys, guys I knew in their 40s and 50s were out playing lacrosse like maniacs. I mean, it's a passion and a point of pride. And they had a team, and the team was going to participate in an international lacrosse tournament. And the lacrosse tournament was in Tel Aviv. And PACB said to them, don't come, you're victims of colonial settler colonialism just like us. It's a betrayal. We're our brothers. Please don't. And I contrasted that with a piece by Judea Pearl, who was a professor at UCLA, whose son Daniel Pearl was a journalist who was beheaded by terrorists, 20-some-odd years ago. And Judea Pearl said, name me another settler colonialist enterprise where the language spoken by the colonialists predated the people that are now seen as indigenous. Name me another place where settler colonialists have talked about this place in poetry and prose and so forth for generation upon generation upon generation. Name me another settler colonialist place where they don't name towns like New Berlin, New York, New Baghdad, but names known in biblical time. And then I quote a historian who said, the ability to put both of these narratives together and understand them collectively is true history. Everything else is communal advocacy. And I think that's the question. How do we distinguish between communal advocacy and the ability to look at the complexities here? And that's what education at its best should be able to do.
Historian David Nurnberg emphasizes the historical fluidity of anti-Semitism. It is not only the prejudice against the Jews, but also has been used at times as a way for societies to make sense of themselves and the world. How do you understand this perspective today? Can we understand anti-Semitism not only as prejudice, but as systemic knowledge that we are most likely to be exposed to when growing up?
Well, that's right. The anti-Semitism has always had political purposes, cultural purposes. It isn't just a question about prejudice against Jews. I mean, one of the things I run a hate studies center. I'm one of the people that helped found the first one at Gonzaga University in Spokane in the 90s. And sometimes the issue would come up, well, aren't you really talking about getting people to live together well, or we're talking about peace with people that are different inside a community? And I said, no, I mean, that's part of it, but I'm more interested about why there's anti-Semitism in Japan. There are no Jews to make peace with, right, or to live with. or by and large. I'm sure there are some Jews, but not a significant part, and that doesn't justify when the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the classic czarist forgery about Jewish conspiracy, becomes a major seller in Japan, which happens from time to time. So people do look at reasons to explain the world, and anti-Semitism, as I said, has been a go-to explainer for people, both because of its history over the years when Jews were excluded on a religious basis, and then the idea of race and some of the more contemporary things now. But what I'm also seeing now that troubles me is not just the classic use of anti-Semitism in a way that we've historically seen to organize people to say, this is a group among us. It's somehow, controlling things, whether it was the idea of Rothschild back in the day or some people saying about, George Soros now or other things like that. It's also people using the claim of anti-Semitism to try to promote an authoritarian agenda. That I think is something that at least I haven't seen before, and it's a concern, obviously.
Historically, Jews have been blamed for contradictory conspiracy charges, being made responsible simultaneously for both capitalism and communism. Do you see a contemporary parallel where Jews are attacked for both supporting Israel and criticizing it?
Yeah, well, first of all, conspiracy theories don't have to be internally consistent. If you believe, one of the things that I wrote about in my militia book, it wasn't necessarily about anti-Semitism, but some of the anti-government views. And when you got into the sort of mindset of these people that were true believers, they were incapable of seeing any other point of view. If it was in the New York Times that was data suggesting that what their belief was wrong, they would say, well, of course, it's part of the conspiracy. So you do see a lot of that type of very narrow, binary thinking. And in that environment, it becomes anything you want to say that's wrong in society, even contradictory things, somehow make sense if you're in that mindset. What's more complicated at the moment about Israel is that you have, on one hand, people holding all Jews collectively responsible for the actions of Israel. And again, when you attack a Jewish person because of something that happens in Israel and you single them out, that's deplorable. Just like when it happens again against Asians, against COVID, other groups as well. That's always deplorable. The complicated thing is that there are messages from some on the in the mainstream Jewish community that are saying basically that Zionism and the support of Israel is just as important to Jewish value as keeping the Sabbath or keeping kosher, and it's essential. And as I said before, even though it's important to me, I understand that there are Jews who have a different point of view, that their religion leads them to different conclusions about the politics of Zionism and so forth. And I think then you have the statements of some of the mainstream Jewish organizations that say you're un-Jews. It's if you don't go down that road, being Jewish means supporting Israel. Then you have these folks on the other side that are saying, see, they're saying that all Jews were somehow responsible for Israel. So there's this contradiction, but that's again part of life. And at the end of the day, we tend to forget to me what's a major lesson about hate and anti-Semitism and all that is that we have to start with the premise that we're all human beings first, and that all these other distinctions really become secondary. If we remember that, we'll be in a better place.
You have cautioned that Jews are historically most at risk when democracy is under attack. Can you explain what you mean by that, and why do you think that the current political fight against anti-Semitism might harm the very people it aims to protect?
Sure. Well, I mentioned before about the McCarthy period where, Jews were in a vulnerable position. Jews were seen as communists by many. You had, Jewish writers in Hollywood who were, prosecuted. You had in that environment too. I mean, I mentioned it in passing in my book, but I'll tell you a family story. There was did you ever learn about the Spanish Civil War? If not, you guys should, because it's the history from 90 years ago is more relevant than ever. But that was the sort of big fight against fascism before World War II with Franco, and there was a group of mostly Americans, but also Brits, George Orwell, some others went to fight in Spain. And there was a guy named Ed Barsky, who was, I'm sure a member of the Communist Party here, who went there and set up the first, what eventually became known as MASH units. They were the mobile hospital stuff. He was the surgeon, set up how do you treat the international soldiers there. He would years later, go down and help set up some of the things for the civil rights workers going in the South. He was much older. Barsky was investigated, I think, partly because he was Jewish and partly because of his work for, against Franco, and was had his medical license stripped for a number of months, was sent to jail when he refused to name names. My parents were both physicians, and they were part of a group that covered his practice. So when he got out, he had a practice to go back to. But it was a very scary time for Jews. And if you look back further in the American history, at the time of the Palmer raids in the early part of the 20th century, again, Jews were seen as subversive, communists and so forth. And it was in an authoritarian place in the United States where Jews had the most at risk in their civil liberties. Certainly look in other countries, Germany, of course. So, I see the lessons I learned from history is that if you cannot organize around free speech and due process and independent judiciary, you have a problem as a community. And the lessons that I learned about speech were not really about Jews. It came from the civil rights movement. It came from Martin Luther King when he started. It came from the anti-war movement. The attempts to suppress King in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the Vietnam era were all attempts to control speech, control expression. And I always, one lesson I learned from history is that when you give government the ability to control speech, it's going to be the speech the government doesn't want, not the speech that you may not want. And in that environment, it promotes conspiratorial thinking, and conspiratorial thinking in that environment inevitably leads to sort of the granddaddy of conspiracy theories, which is anti-Semitism.
In closing, we always give our guests a little segment where they can address our listeners. And I'd like to ask you, from your extensive experience combating anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, what is the most important insight you would like to share with us, with our listeners, especially here in Germany, where we carry a unique historical responsibility?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a silver bullet in any of this. I mean, there's obviously hatred has been around for a long time, anti-Semitism too. I think the major things to consider is, again, that we're all human beings first, to have the emotional empathy and the intellectual curiosity to think about why people may have a different point of view about things, and becomes, especially you asked about TikTok and other things before, in the age of social media and cable news, it's very easy to be seduced into, here's, people that say things that I agree with, and getting more and more insulated from that. I think, as you're growing up, it's important to engage ideas that you find from others. I mean, I've said this many times. When my wife and I, who see things pretty much eye to eye, she's always upset when she turns on the TV and sees the last channel it was on was Fox News or Newsmax, which in the United States are sort of the right-wing MAGA stations. And she said, how can you watch that? And my response is, how can I not watch that? I mean, the majority of people voted in a way that very much, reflects what they were articulating. And how can I, as a citizen, not imagine how they were thinking about things and to engage those ideas? And when I talk to college students, I say a couple of things. One is that I tell them, as I mentioned, I used to be a criminal defense attorney. I can't imagine it not being malpractice to have gone into a courtroom representing somebody without having at least spent some energy thinking about how I would have approached the case as a prosecutor. You have to look at it from that other point of view to be able to become a better advocate yourself. So even if you're on one side or another of the Israel-Palestine debate, to become a better advocate, you better learn what makes the other side tick, as opposed to just saying, they're evil, I'm going to write them off, everything they say is awful. No, it's to your interest to become a better advocate, to understand, their point of view better. And the other thing I say to college students too is that if you think that this is just so simple, all justice is on one side, all horrors on the other side, alarm bells should be going off, because you're being seduced by, again, the sort of what our brains tell us is to put things into these silos of good and bad. You miss so much when you get seduced, but it makes you more comfortable. It's part of your team. You feel, rah, 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 and the other side is evil, or, it's just like a sporting event. You should be engaged in looking for the complexity. And I think the more that we can do that, always remembering that we're human beings first, the better off we'll be.
That being said, this marks the end of our podcast. Professor Stern, thank you so much for taking the time and for your valuable insight on everything.
Oh, thank you so much for doing this. And I really appreciate this entire initiative. I think it's critically important, and I wish it could be cloned.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.